Welcome to a brief mini-lecture on qualitative ethics. So at its simplest, ethics is a system of moral principles concerned with what is good for individuals and society. In research, Hayes and Singh define research ethics as a set of guidelines established to guide thinking and behavior. They go on to differentiate between the different sets of ethics possible within research communities. However, this definition is quite simple and does not really point to the complexity of research ethics within qualitative inquiry. There are many standpoints, and often the ethical line of reasoning we take depends on our philosophy of science, the methodology we choose, the purpose of our research, and the institution in which we study. The traditional goal of research ethics is to guarantee that research is conducted to the benefit of society as a whole and that the benefits outweigh the risk. Generally, our institutions approach research ethics as the application of moral rules and professional codes of conduct to the collection, analysis, reporting, and publication of research with a focus on human participants and the active acceptance of their right to privacy, confidentiality, and informed consent. This approach to research ethics stems from a principle standpoint, ethical decision-making based on codes of conduct, and utilitarianism, that these guidelines are value-free and linear. To follow these guidelines, we adhere to the IRB in order to assure that we have met the bare minimum of ethical principles in our fields. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on these processes, and hopefully you're going to be covering them throughout your graduate career, but we are going to look at some of the principles as concerns qualitative inquiry specifically, and some of the complexities therein, focusing specifically in the next few slides on relationships, privacy, and consent. When we talk about qualitative research ethics, the relationship between the researcher and participant is central. So it's important to ask ourselves the central question, what would a participant need from me to trust me? Ethically, it's our responsibility to create the conditions where participants feel respected and in control of their stories and experiences. And we need to understand that trust is never automatic or ever guaranteed. So how do we ethically try to build the conditions of trust? One piece is self-disclosure, letting participants know who we are and why we are doing the work that we do. Transparency is an ethical practice. Another is to do no harm. In qualitative work, that means being careful with people's times, their emotion and experiences, and anticipating where they might feel vulnerable. We always ask who benefits from research, understanding that ethical research isn't about extracting information, and that participants understand how their contributions matter and who gains from the findings. Ultimately, protecting participants is core, and that means protecting them from both psychological and physical harm. A big part of that is preparation. We give participants a clear sense of the topics we'll be discussing, so nothing feels like a surprise. During the interview, we use clear, direct questions so they're not left guessing about what we're really asking. And sometimes when a topic becomes emotional, we can pivot. We can slow down or shift the conversation and just check in. What we don't do is slide into the role of a therapist. Our job is to support their comfort and safety, not to provide counseling. Another complicated idea is that of privacy. So we do not attempt to provide anonymity in qualitative research. So while in quantitative surveys, people can take the survey without a researcher ever knowing the identity of participants, usually the best a qualitative researcher can do is offer confidentiality. Confidentiality is where the researcher knows the identity of participants, but does not release any identifiable details. Seems easy enough, right? However, it's not. It's a risky ground that we traverse when we're working so intimately with our participants. So for example, what do we do in focus group settings or participatory groups, where participants are seen together and they're going to hear each other's interviews and thus our data? Or what if you're working with participants who want their names included as an act of advocacy, but the IRB will not allow it? Or if you use photo voice or other art documentary elements where it would be difficult to remove identifiable information. What about in settings where you're immersed in the social arena, say doing a school ethnography, where the expectations of you and your participants are blurry, and there may be role boundary confusion? We also have to tell participants about the limits of confidentiality. If someone discloses harm to themselves or others, or a situation that we're legally required to report, we can't keep that private. We have to be transparent about those limits as part of the ethical consent process. We also have many ways to try to protect the confidentiality of our participants. The most basic is using pseudonyms. Another is through aggregate reporting. Instead of singling anyone out, we can summarize patterns. So in this study, participants shared that, and this can keep individual identities out of focus. Another strategy is using composite narratives, where we blend quotes or experiences from multiple people into one voice. And it still represents the data, but no single participant is directly exposed. And then there's creative representations like poetry, which lets us convey meaning or emotion in a creative way without tying the words to one identifiable person. All of these help us ensure we're honoring the stories without risking someone's privacy. So this leads us to the idea of informed consent. In research, informed consent is the process of making sure participants clearly understand what the study is about and what their involvement will look like before they agree to take part. It's not just a signature on a form, it's a conversation that ensures they're genuinely informed and freely choosing to participate. We use informed consent because it protects participants' autonomy. It gives them power to decide whether this is something they really want to be a part of. It also means we're upfront about the purpose of the study, the kinds of questions we'll ask, any potential risk, and what benefits, if any, they might expect. And it establishes their rights. Can they skip questions? Can they take a break? Or can they stop altogether at any point? And finally, informed consent sets expectations about privacy. We explain how their data will be used, who will see it, and how we'll work to protect their identity. So overall, informed consent is about transparency, respect, and making sure participants are truly in control of their participation. However, one study found that when informed consent was done at the beginning of the interview, less than 20% of participants see reading and signing the document as a decision point. This is problematic, as it suggests informed consent feels more like a check in the box than an actual moment to withdraw from the study. Now, let's just look at a few parts of informed consent. So before someone participates in research, we have to be honest about the potential benefits and possible cost or risk. This helps them make an informed, balanced decision about whether the study is right for them. But how do we determine what is a benefit and how benefits will be derived? As qualitative researchers, we are often working from the bottom up. We're not engaged in hypothesis testing, meaning that we typically are not clear on what our outcomes should or could be. We have to make a best guess about what these outcomes from our literature review and theory. If we're not testing a hypothesis, as is more common in quant research, how can we then determine the benefits? Also, many of us research challenging topics that can bring up traumatic memories or shameful experiences. How can we predict harm will come to participants if their quotes are read by people known to them and if they are outed as participants in the study? And finally, it's upon us to recognize that most frequently, the benefit of research is most highly given to that of the researcher and not the participants. So then we must ask, how do we honestly and fairly evaluate the benefits and risk to our participants? So moving into the idea of voluntary participation, there are large power differentials between researchers and participants, and the principle of voluntary participation requires that people not be coerced into participating in research. However, we really don't know when someone is voluntarily participating when we're offering incentives. So for example, I've conducted research in Cambodia, where at the time the average daily wage was $1 per day. If I were to want to offer an incentive, I have to think about what would be coercive as far as an incentive goes. So if I wanted to say offer $5, which for a US research project would not seem coercive, but if I were to offer $5 in Cambodia, that would be the average of a week's wages. So that could potentially be a coercive measure. So I have to think about how can I offer an incentive that would not potentially just coerce someone into participating to make money. Another aspect of voluntary participation is the ability to withdraw at any time. However, we have to ask what that means for qualitative research. And quantitative research, wherein people might be taking a survey online and can just shut the program down if they no longer want to participate, it's not so simple for qualitative research. I suppose a participant could just stand up and leave an interview, but what if they reach out to you after the interview is complete and they decide they do not want to participate anymore? Do you give them the right to remove their transcript, or do you keep their interview as data? This gets to the question of who owns the data. In situations where we're immersed in the context, we must work to actively distinguish between our obligations and responsibilities of the relationship to our participants and in our research, and any expectations arising from those relationships. Ultimately, qualitative research isn't something we handle at the beginning and forget about. It's an ongoing practice, one that shapes how we build trust, how we ask questions, and how we protect people's stories, and how we represent them in our work. And at the heart of ethical qualitative research is a simple commitment. If participants trust us with their stories, we must handle those stories with care, humility, and responsibility.